Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for being with us. My name is Missen Fantin. I am Executive Director for Design Art Seminars. I'm very happy to have Dr. Toby Israel with us today. Dr. Israel is the founder of the field of design psychology and here with us today to discuss her book, Someplace Like Home, using design psychology to create ideal places. Also with us today is Lynn Wilkinson, who is one of our CEU presenters, subject matter experts, and also an NCIDQ certified interior designer based in Austin, Texas. So before we get going, Toby, to someone unfamiliar with the topic of design psychology, how would you define it?
Well, it has an official definition. I say it is the practice of architecture, planning, and interior design in which psychology is the principal design tool.
Interesting. Now, I'm always curious when I come across authors of different kinds of books, and I always want to find out what led you to write a book on design psychology.
Right, interesting question. Well, I started out, I've had a couple of different lives, and in my first life, I was a teacher, and I worked with children in some very interesting educational settings and was interested in how they interacted with those places and also looked at some new ways to design school buildings. And I thought, I'm really interested in architecture, thought I might want to be an architect, looked at all the different architecture schools that I was interested in going with, and found that most of them were about either function or aesthetics. And very few of the programs, if any, talked about the people aspect of places. And really, it was the people aspect that I was interested in. So I kind of went away a little bit dejected, and then came across the field of environmental psychology. And that field is a field where we look to see how the environment affects people, and people affect the environment in order to create a fit or a match between people and place. And when I found out about that field, I thought, Eureka! Because it really was the people aspect, how people respond to places socially and emotionally, that I was interested in as much as the aesthetic and functional aspect of place. So I got a PhD in that field, but part of the problem with environmental psychology, and I love my environmental psychology colleagues, is that that's a research field, and I was really interested in turning it into a field that could be applied.
Now, given that we are a continuing education company, a lot of time is spent on wondering how the different topics that we come across enhance health, safety, and well-being for the end user. So how will knowing more about design psychology help design professionals enhance and promote the health, safety, and well-being of their clients?
Right. Well, for one thing, I say I'm on a mission. I particularly want to first raise the consciousness of designers that this social and emotional aspect, how people respond emotionally and interact with other people, is just as important as those aesthetic and functional aspects. Because very often what's taught in design schools are things about the aesthetics and the function. So that's the first part of it. I teach people that, there's this whole other world that I don't really know that much about. And then once they're kind of convinced that it's really important, I have a design psychology toolbox, which is basically a programming process that designers can use to help their clients, what I call design from within their inner psychology, to support their positive growth and change.
Okay, so in other words, we were always taught in school it's form and function, so you're really just talking about form, function, and feelings. Adding another layer.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, well, I am an old school designer. I won't even tell you how old. But one of the things is when I was back in design school, when we were using stone tablets and chisels, I started out with hand drafting. And when you have to hand draft, your design process is very different and it takes place in your head. And I'm working with the young designers now, and a lot of them have never even learned to hand draft. They've gone straight into the computer assisted drafting or the CAD drafting. And I noticed that their designs lack some things because I think that part of the process has changed. And in your book, you specifically mention that you think CAD has really affected design. And I'm curious, what do you think this impact of technology is going to be on design and the design process, because it's becoming more prevalent?
Right. Well, everything has its upside and downside. I mean, the great news about CAD is that you can do a lot of things more quickly, and you can do things with technology to create building types that are more complex than you might have been able to do if you were just using hand drawings. But the process of drawing itself is an expressive art form, as any visual artist will tell you. So again, there's that kind of human aspect that can be left out, or kind of sensitivity that you may not be tapping into if you're a designer just using CAD or BIM or one of the newest and greatest types of systems to create a space.
I agree.
So, talking about the human aspect, in your book, you zoom in on three individuals: Andreas Duany, Michael Graves, Charles Jenks, and I was just curious, why did you select those three examples?
Well, it was as much a practical reason and serendipity as anything else. I started off with Michael Graves because he lived up the street from me here in Princeton, New Jersey, and I simply wrote him a letter and said, okay, here's what I'm doing, this is what I'm writing about, and would you like to be involved? And lo and behold, he said yes. So it was very easy to walk up the street and work with him. And of course, he was a great person to work with because he is or was an internationally known architect. Then he knew Charles Jenks, and he knew that Charles Jenks was very interested in meaning in architecture, symbols in architecture, and he thought that Charles Jenks would be interested in what I was up to. So he referred me to Charles Jenks. And then in terms of Andreas Duany, I was working for an architecture and planning firm as running their research division. And that architecture firm, Looney Ricks Kiss, was doing work with Andreas Duany. And they got very interested in what I was doing. So Looney Ricks Kiss put me on to Andreas Duany. So that's how it happened.
One thing I noticed as I was reading through the book, all three of those gentlemen are really well known for being proponents of new types of architecture. They've basically been the founders of quite a few of these things, postmodernism in particular, and just the term of that, and the whole idea of new urbanism. So a lot of those things from these three gentlemen. So I'm just curious, was one of the reasons that you kind of did hone in on them, a little serendipity into, but that they're doing the new versions of the built environment? And I thought it was really interesting to see how the old aspects, going back into environmental design and psychology, how they kind of used that to build theirs. So, I mean, was that another element of the selection of their appropriateness for your book?
Well, I'd like to say yes, and it was all a very plotted out plan, but it really wasn't. And in fact, I would have liked to have other architects and interior designers represented who had a different approach, just to kind of show that, okay, no matter what your style is in terms of architecture, it all comes from unconsciously your childhood experience of place, and the direction that you go in is influenced by that. But I've kind of now decided to redress that imbalance, and I'm working on another book that in particular includes, or not just includes, but focuses on women in architecture with different styles and different approaches.
Wonderful, wonderful. And, and even somebody who's an historic architect could address that, and particularly when it comes to the past. And I really liked how you broke out your book and the tools to do this process into past, present, and future. And in the section that you did on the past, I thought it was kind of interesting that you mentioned this archetype, the archetype of self and the symbolism of the home. And can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Well, I wasn't the first one to look at personal history of place, what we call environmental autobiography, and how that influences your sense of place and home. One person who I was particularly interested in and influenced by was a woman named Claire Cooper Marcus, who wrote a landmark article called House as Symbol of Self. And basically what she talked about were those archetypes, that word coming from the psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, who believed that there was a connection between, for example, symbolism around house and symbolism around self. So all of these people, including myself, believe that we kind of carry around these archetypes, these almost primal notions of self and house, and they're reflected both in our dreams and in what we unconsciously create.
Certainly rings true for me. Now, earlier you started mentioning the tool box that you outline in your book, and I started doing the exercises, and definitely very, very insightful. What I was wondering is how would you like to see design professionals apply these tools?
Right. Well, this idea that we kind of unconsciously hold within us our sense of place is kind of like what we could call a hidden dimension that we're not really aware of. So the first thing I like designers to do is to do what you've done, is take themselves through these exercises to become aware of their own design predispositions. So for example, designer might be working with a client and think, oh, this color is perfect, or this particular style would work so well. And especially if they're not good at kind of digging with the client or don't have that expertise fine-tuned, they might assume just because they, as the designer, like that, that works for the client. So first they have to, the designer that is, has to become aware of the difference between their predisposition and that of the client. And then once they're a little bit more attuned to, okay, there's this whole psychological dimension, then they can use the toolbox as a programming technique, a programming process to delve into their own clients' past, present, and future, which in effect reveals that hidden dimension, that sense of self and place that may not, or probably doesn't come to the fore unless designers have been trained to use that technique.
Interesting, because I think a lot of designers are unconsciously or subconsciously, not sure of the proper term on that, I think a lot of them might be subconsciously doing that to a certain degree. The joke in the industry is that to a certain degree, anybody who does interior design is part marriage counselor, part therapist, a little bit of everything. We're kind of the hairdressers
Absolutely.
of the design world. And it's kind of, so we are kind of doing a little bit of this. And, as I was going through your book, I tell you what, there's some really great tools in there. There really are, and great ways to phrase the questions to get to usable information. And, it's wonderful to have an interview with your client, but you need to be able to apply what you learn. And so they were great for guiding that. And so that was, some of the things that I took away. But what is, when you were writing this book, I'm sure that you had something that you really wanted people to just be able to take away from it at the conclusion of it. And if professionals in the industry are the ones that are reading the book, what is it that you really want them to be able to take away from the book?
That's a great question. Basically, what I want people to take away is that there is meaning in place, okay, that there are messages about people, who they are, and what their life journey is. And the idea of design psychology is to tap into the meaning that places uniquely have for each person, so that when we design, and design from, again, what I call design from within, we can help people express and tell their own story and move along their own life journey in a positive and fulfilling way, as expressed via their home design or space design.
Okay. I've got a little follow-up question that's kind of partly on that. The kids that are growing up today, their past in another 25 years is going to be vastly different than any of our generation because they grew up with such a different world and technology and dynamics between people. How do you envision that might impact what buildings look like? Do you think buildings are going to really change significantly because their psychology is going to be so different, their environmental psychology? Or do you think humanity the basic design is still going to be the same because we're still humans?
You're tapping into a great area of concern of mine, because yes, of course, we look at everybody walking along the street, and I often think, well, what if Martians landed on Earth and they said, why are people looking at these square little boxes? They walk along the street. It would be like
exactly.
really confusing to them. But my concern isn't how buildings will look given this new technology. My concern is how people will be in the world given this new technology. So, for example, when I, in the book, explored my own environmental autobiography, my own personal story, I went back to my childhood experience of place and thought about what were the most meaningful, kind of riveting places for me. And they were places in the woods. They were natural environments. And when I do my exercises, I'd say most people, definitely a majority of people, go back to some natural place. And with people and children and young people using all these devices, they're disconnected from the natural world. And it's a very concerning thing because that's kind of like ripping out a whole part of us. So part of what I say is my mission is that we need to preserve natural places. I was just scanning out places in Florida away from the maddening crowd where I could perhaps get a retreat space for my grandchildren to be, where they could be exploring the woods and not the malls where all the other kids are gathering with their devices.
Getting challenging to find
so that. I think it's as much about kind of preserving natural resources and exposing people to other environments besides the built and digital world. That being said, it goes back to your question about CAD and other programs. Yeah, I mean, you look at the work of Frank Gehry, and without those programs, he probably couldn't have engineered some of those great buildings. Or I look at the new World Trade Center transit hub, and again, without those technology tools, those buildings couldn't be created. But when I look at the overall feeling of, let's say, Calatrava's new transit center, it's so human, it's so inspirational. So it's more than the digital, capabilities. It's more getting people to understand or to think more sensitively about what human places are and how people react to them.
Great, thank you. I love the takeaway idea that there is meaning in place. I think it's critically important. Thank you for taking us on a much deeper dive in the topic of design psychology. Now, for those interested in going deeper and learning more about design psychology and the work you do, or maybe even connecting with you, what's the best way for our listeners to do that?
A great beginning is to read my book, Someplace Like Home, Using Design Psychology to Create Ideal Places. Then I also write a blog for Psychology Today called Design on My Mind, which particularly looks at the different things that I'm moving into now, from healing environments to, as I mentioned, women by design. Then I also, of course, you all at Design Arts help lead people through the book in the CEU that you're giving. I also give webinars a few times a year where I work with people from all over the world through distance learning, taking them through my exercises and talking about how to use them. And then for those who are really interested, I have a design psychology certification program, which is a year-long program, again through distance learning, where I work with people one-to-one, teaching them in depth how to use the toolbox that they find at the end of someplace like home. And of course, there's my website, designpsychology.net, where you can read all about it.
Thank you for sharing that information. And as you mentioned, we do have your book approved as a distance learning program by both the American Institute of Architects and the Interior Design Continuing Education Council. So if you're interested in learning more and earning CEU credits at the same time, definitely check that out on our website at designarts.org. But Dr. Israel, thank you so very much for taking the time and helping us understand a bit more about design psychology and how to design from within, as you've put it. Definitely appreciate the time you spent with us today. And to those listening, thank you for being with us. Please don't hesitate to reach out with any question you might have or any comments. We'd love to
Thank you.
hear from
It's
you.
been great talking with you.
Thank you, Dr. Israel.